functionality and also in the Q&A session. I will also answer some questions that you asked when you were signing up for this webinar, in case you can clarify them a little bit better, and also in the Q&A session. And let me know maybe how they work. This would be really great. I will also answer some questions that you should be seeing my screen now with InfraNodus. Please let me know if you're having technical difficulties. In this session, I'm going to demonstrate some of the new features that were added to the tool in the last month. And also, as we go along, I will answer some questions as well that you might have about using the tool. I already looked through some of the questions that were asked during the registration process, and if you could clarify them. So for example, someone asked how to highlight the nodes in the map. If you could clarify that in the chat window in Zoom or in the Q&A session. And also visualizing logistic network flow. There was another question like this. I would like to know what kind of data you have. There was a question about search engine optimization, which I will answer. And also a question on how to identify the central idea of different interactions in which there isn't a single but different central ideas and clusters. So this we will also take care of. In the meanwhile, we'll wait for the others to join in. Please make yourself familiar with the Q&A section and the webinar chat as well. And we will begin in half a minute. Some people have been asking if it's possible to visualize LinkedIn network. It's not, because LinkedIn doesn't give access to this data. But what you can do is to create a file, just like a spreadsheet or a CSV file with the relations within your organization manually, and then visualize this and analyze the graph. There are also some external tools that allow you to visualize social network data, but it's not really easy to get this data from the source itself. Okay, so we will begin. Today I'm going to show to you how to use the new functionality in InfraNodus and some of the new features that have been added in the last weeks. So first of all, starting with the simple stuff, you have a new color theme, which is called here darker color in the settings panel. And if you select that, you will see the colors on the graph differently than before. It's going to look something like this, which is actually pretty helpful if you want your labels to be shown in the same color as the nodes on the white background. So maybe some of you don't know about this new functionality. It is here in the settings. Then now you can select the label size to be the node size and adjust the size of the labels. And then you can also set them to be the same color as the nodes. So then it becomes a little bit more aesthetically interesting. If you click here, you can see it on the black background. And then what I like to do also is to use the filter panel and to remove some of the nodes and then to turn on the alignment again. So this is just some visual features that have been added that you might find interesting. Also, for those of you who didn't see it yet, you can also change the edges types to be curves here. And you can also switch to abstract layout or back to nodes and text. And then also, of course, you can hide the labels for different nodes. So if you want to see the labels only for the most influential nodes, then you can adjust this slider here. Then in the analytics panel, we have some new additions here in the trends pane. That is showing the emerging keywords. So these are the keywords that emerged in the end of the discourse in the last 20% of the statements that you have. These might indicate some interesting topics that are just trending in a particular narrative. And then we also have the evolution of topics in time. So I will switch back to the light theme here. You can see how the discourse evolved over time. We have the main topics here identified using network analysis. For those of you who don't know how it works, every node is a word. Every co-occurrence of the words is the connection between them. Then based on the modularity algorithm, the words that tend to appear more often together will have the same color. Just like here, you have this cosmic contingency abyss. It's philosophical text, so the terms are a little bit strange. Model, energy, organism, sun, earth, dying, life, water, terrestrial. These are the 4 topics. If you click here, you see more of them. And there you have the most influential elements, and the most influential elements are not only the nodes that have the most connections or that have the highest influence, but they're the ones that appear most often between different topical groups. So they are somehow the crossroads for meaning circulation in this text. And this is the difference of InfraNodus from other systems that just show you the most frequent terms. Here you see the words that matter on the global level. So a word might have not so many connections, but it's going to be influential if it connects the most diverse range of elements together. And then in the trends panel here, you can see how these topics evolved in time. So you have the 4 main topics here and the most influential words. Here you have the first one, cosmic contingency abyss. Then you have model, energy, organism. And you can see that, for example, model and energy was around this area, 30 to 40% through the narrative. This is the parts of the narrative. It's divided in about 10 parts. So each digit is, if you multiply it by 10, is the percentage of the narrative. So here we have, at about 1/3 of the discourse evolution, we had this topic coming up. Then there was this big one here, life, water, terrestrial, coming up around 80% of the discourse. And this topic, sun, earth, and dying, has been reoccurring throughout the whole narrative. So that can be an interesting tool for you to see how a certain discourse evolved over time. This can be interesting if you do literary studies or if you're studying customer sentiment in time, how a certain product perception evolved over a certain period. Or if you study social networks as well. Don't forget that if you have any questions as I go along, you can have questions, ask questions in the chat panel and in the Q&A section. I will answer to them as we go along. Last thing about evolution of topics, you can also see how they evolved in time if you drag this slider here. So you can see that, for example, this text starts from putting out the main ideas, sun and earth and cosmic, and then going to life, water, and so on, and then expanding on the subtopics, and then coming to the final idea of the discourse. Maybe I'm going to use a text that you would be more familiar with. So this was a philosophy text. Let's say I take Obama's 2013 inauguration speech. I'm going to load this here. Bear with my internet connection, is not so fast today. Okay, so here we have the graph of Obama's speech. And here directly you can see how the topics evolved over time. You can see that this one, America Journey Complete, came up at around 80%. So there was a big sort of event towards the end of this narrative where Obama was talking about the journey of America and how it has to be complete or how it has to be completed. And then at the beginning, we see that the main topics or the most influential words were actually not so frequent. So that means that he started his talk from a smaller topical cluster, from smaller, less relevant to the whole discourse somehow. And this is an interesting rhetorical tool. You know, you start from a few stories that are maybe quite local in a way, or they have a very local meaning, and then you go to the main terms after, like require time, American, citizen, journey, and so on. So this is how you can use this evolution of topics feature to analyze how the discourse evolved. Also, if you click on this button here, it's going to work a little bit slower, but it's also going to show you how the influence changed. So this is why it's a bit more precise. You will see that at the very beginning of the discourse, he's talking about life, right, creator. So something about the creator and how liberty is an important part of human experience. Then the next stage, he's saying something about people and freedom. Then the notion of people becomes more important. You see, it becomes bigger. Its influence is higher now, 1/3 through the narrative. Then he's talking about fellows today, government principles, the founding principles of the government of America, and so on. Then halfway through the narrative, we see that the discourse is becoming quite diverse. He's talking about generations and how it's important to build democracy and so on. Then as we move further, we see that, okay, now he's starting to talk about the time that requires us to do something. And this is a very typical tool in his speeches. If you analyze several of them, there's always this kind of like main thing coming towards the end. And then if we move further, we will see that there's something about man created equal, and then some more kind of constructions of the already existed topics towards the end. And this is how it looks. So this is how you can use this feature. By the way, if you're interested to see how a narrative evolved over time and you don't want to just see the build up, but you want to see every statement separately, what you can also do is to roll at the beginning of the text and then click on the button here and choose evolution. So this is a default section, and then click here and you will see how the narrative evolved over time. So it doesn't show you the final picture, it just shows you the current one. You can also see which topics were important at that part. So it basically shows you only the visible statements on the graph. And as you scroll down, you can see how the discourse evolved over time along with the change in the influence. So you see that here, halfway through, a little bit further, we're talking about war and peace. Here, we're talking about opportunities and dignity, equal opportunities, journey complete. And here, time requires 80% of the discourse. So this is just another way to read through the text. And I encourage you to use these features because it's a pretty interesting way to read any text because you start to see it in a different way. But also it can offer some really interesting insights about the discourse that you're studying. Even if it's something a bit more practical, seeing how it evolves in time can give you some really interesting insights that the analysis of the structure alone or just the extraction of the topical groups will not give you. You also have an interesting option here. If you click highlight statements and then you have to click save and then you turn this on again, then you see how the discourse propagated in time over the whole structure. So this can be also an interesting way to see if there are recurrent topics that tend to come up as the narrative unfolds. We have a question in the Q&A session. There are nodes quite divorced from the bigger graph. How does it happen? So these are the nodes that are not so connected to the rest of the network, and this is why it happens. So for example, let's see, if we have these ones, right? So for example, here he's talking about blood drawn by lash. This is definitely not something that he mentions again in another context. This is why it stays like an island on its own, because it's not really connected. If you see more nodes on the graph, because the limit is 150, of course it's going to be connected to some other nodes. But basically, it's a separate island of meaning, which is not so relevant to the main discourse, but it was used as a rhetorical tool to bring an analogy inside. So usually you will have some interesting analogies appearing on the periphery of the graph. Another question, most influential elements are defined by betweenness. Yes, they're defined by betweenness centrality, a measure that is used in network science and graph theory, and you can read more about it on our support portal. And I'm going to send the link into the chat where you can find it. So if you go there and then you click, if you type in betweenness, you will be able to see the help article on that subject. Okay, then we move further. So here we had this dynamical structure of the narrative shown and the most emerging keywords. I also showed you how you can watch the narrative unfold over time. And what is really connected to it is a new feature that might seem a little bit technical at first, but it's very, very interesting. And it's this new influence propagation field. And by the way, now you can drag these panels if you click here next to the close sign. So you can align them and change their size how you wish accordingly. Okay, so you see that, for example, in this discourse, what we have here in this panel are the insights about the network structure, which we already had before. So we see that the structure is diverse. That means it consists of separate topics that are connected on the global level, but that are quite distinct from one another, which are shown with the different colors. So we have this on the graph, and usually this is based on the modularity measure and influence distribution. If the modularity is high, then the structure is diversified. But there are also other parameters involved. If you click on the question mark here, you'll see which other parameters are used there. You also have a little bit more statistics about the graph if you click on this table here. Now, we just looked at how the narrative propagates over time and how the different topics evolve. But you can also see how the influence propagated through the graph as the narrative unfolded. And this is pretty interesting because it shows you how the text was actually presented, right? So here you have quite a lot of fluctuations. And that means that as the narrative unfolded, Obama, in his speech, was referring a lot to the most influential words all the time. So basically, there was almost never a time where he was not saying something about American or require time. So always going back to the original influential terms that form the backbone of his speech. And you see it's quite regular. And it's not only regular, it happens so that each time he is mentioning a frequent word, then he goes on to the smaller ones here. And this is why it's called antagonistic variability. So the narrative is variable, but in a way that if there is a frequently mentioned word or a word with a high betweenness centrality, it is likely that then it will be followed by a phrase which has words of lower betweenness centrality. And this is usually used in speeches, to allude to certain topics. Like we say something about American principles, and then we go into history and give an example or an analogy from a historical perspective. Then we come back to the fact that the times require for us to act, and then we go from here into smaller, less relevant topics to give an example of what we mean. As the opposite of this, I'm going to show you another text. I think it's going to be this Clinton inauguration speech of 1993. Right, so here the picture is a little bit different. As you can see on this graph, there were some fluctuations, but then there was also a point around 1/3 through the narrative where he was not mentioning any frequently or any high between the centrality words. So that means that at some point during the narrative, he went into a very specific story that didn't have so much relation to the main topics of the discourse, but maybe it was used as an example or as a rhetorical device or as an analogy to sort of present a certain idea in a way that is maybe a little bit more poetic or that brings in some other allusions and impressions. And here the alpha exponent is high, it's 0.62. And it says also that there is variability, but it's irregular. So this is typical for the texts which make use of specific examples. Let's say it's also used a lot in literary fiction and poetry as well, and so on. Here it's in Bill Clinton's 1993 speech. Also, if you use this tool that I showed you before, that allows you to see how the narrative evolved over time. So we highlight the statements, turn it on. We will see that as it moves along, is using world, America, America, world. But then there is a point in the narrative when those influential words are not so much used. So for example, here we have this little cluster here, millions here. Okay, so not throughout the whole narrative those words are appearing. Sometimes they disappear, and sometimes the focus is shifted to the smaller ones that might have less relevance globally, but that still are very important to give a certain idea to the narrative. So this is how you can use this feature to analyze the discourse. Here, I will look at the chat, okay. And basically, the science behind this is all explained if you click on the question mark here or there. But basically, it uses the same measure that is used to analyze heart rate variability, called detrended fluctuation analysis. And this measure allows you to see how fractal a certain dynamic process is. And in the context of medicine, this is used to study variability of a heartbeat. And apparently, if the heartbeat variability is fractal, then the body is in a healthy state. But if it loses its fractality, we might be dealing with some pathologies. It's also a similar phenomenon that can be observed in physical movement as well. In fact, a lot of natural systems, they exhibit fractal variability in how they move and how they operate and the dynamics of their evolution. And fractal in this context doesn't mean that you will see Mandelbrot images, fractals all the time. It just means a certain amount of self-similarity, which can be seen both on the smallest and on the biggest scale. And when we apply this to a discourse, it's the same thing. Is this discourse fractal over a period of time? When we jump from one influential node to another, and then we go to a small one after this, and then we travel to another small one, then we will come to the big one again, and so on, you know? So we're constantly traveling through the graph, and each node in the graph has a certain influence. The way that we travel through the graph indicates how we propagate meaning through it. And what can be interesting to look at, or that can give us a different perspective on the text, is to see how fractal this propagation of meaning actually is, and whether or not we are operating through the main nodes only and we just use the small ones as secondary, or if we're using the secondary nodes in a way that sometimes we really go deep into them and explore a certain topic which doesn't have any relation to the main agenda, and then come back to the original influential terms and continue our discourse. So this is quite an interesting approach. I encourage you to use it with your own text. So with the text that you like, here I have analysis of a lot of different stuff. For example, if you look at Nabokov's writing, which is an excerpt from his novel called The Gift, you will see that the structure of the graph here is pretty interesting, because a lot of nodes have a lot of influence. So that means that the vocabulary is quite rich, and it has a cyclical variability. So Nabokov, in his prose, often makes use of cycles in terms of how the narrative unfolds. So he will speak about a certain topic. Let's say, we'll just save this like this, okay. So he will speak about pines. So it's an excerpt where the author is in the forest, and he's walking through the forest and experiencing different parts of it somehow. And if we look at the whole graph, we'll see that the main terms are the needles, spines, and trunks. It's what the author is wearing. And here they're shown in the essence panel, and that they also form a topical cluster. So pine, trunk, and forest, they form a single topical cluster. But then what happens? When the narrative evolves, he's using those words as the backbone for meaning, but then he goes to the smaller ones to zoom in into a certain aspect of the forest, and then comes back to the pine needles. Then again, there's something about the sand, the forest, a child, a dust. Then again, pine, forest, trunk, but then now he's talking about the sun and the green oaks and silk brown. Then again, we have the sun now is the influential term. And then it goes on to talk about the shore of the lake and so on. So as you can see, it's sort of going like a refrain through the main topics and then zooming in to the particulars. And this is why the narrative evolves in this cyclical way. This is also a certain stylistic feature of Nabokov texts, and it can be quite interesting to analyze it in this way. And you will see that with different kind of authors, with different kind of styles, you have a completely different approach. If you take George Orwell, for example, let's say his text on Why I Write, and load this text here. Then you will see that here the variability is a bit higher. You know, the alpha exponent is a bit higher. It means that he is also making use of the main topics like writing a book, but there are some parts of his narrative where he's shifting to the smaller secondary subjects. And this can be quite interesting as a tool to support his main point. In general, what you will notice also analyzing the texts in this way is that if the variability of the narrative is quite high, so if the alpha exponent is quite high, it means that the text is not really trying to push you a certain agenda. But if it's cyclical or low, then it might be that the main terms are actually used to push a certain idea, and any deviations into the periphery of the narrative are only there to support the main idea. So even if you have the structure that will be diverse, how it is the case here, the fact that there is a refrain on writing a book, so all the ideas are towards writing a book, or what is the experience of writing and why one writes and so on, we know that this text is somehow biased towards those two topics. So this is just an additional way for you to see the dimension of time, which is sometimes lost from the discourse structure analysis. Ralph is asking, could he use this to analyze a negotiation? This is a very interesting question. For example, a group of fishermen could be negotiating on fishing rights with regulators. We can get a transcript of the entire conversation, so you could see the topics evolve over time and how topics are used to advance a position. Exactly, this would be a very interesting use case. If you have some kind of data that show an evolution of a discussion over time, I guess the easiest available data are the political debates, in fact, because in some countries they have to make transcripts of everything that has been discussed. So maybe this is an interesting place to start from, but also you could start from this example that you provide on the negotiation of the fishing rights with regulators. And what you could also do is to make a CSV table, a spreadsheet, where you have in one column everything that people said, and in the other column you mark who said what, and then you would be able to import it through the CSV import app here. And then choose one column of the file to be used as for categorizing your data. And then what that means is that when you have the actual text shown, you will have the categories shown at the top filter menu, like here. And that would allow you to see, like, okay, what are the contexts, what are the topics used only by the fishermen, what are the words that are used only by the regulators, and then also all together. So you would be able to have this additional dimension. And of course, you could analyze both of them separately. So you could analyze how the arguments presented by the fishermen evolved over time and what was their strategy, and how the response of the negotiators also evolved over time and what was their strategy. And then you analyze everything together at once. And I think it would be really interesting to find out, if there is any correlation between the sort of dynamics that we can observe and the results of the negotiation. I can imagine that because higher alpha is usually associated with a higher adaptability, if you are in the position of having to adjust, you will be better off having a more fractal argument, or an argument that is more fractally structured. That means that you would have moments like here on the graph, that you're not mentioning so much the most influential terms, so you're not insisting all the time that, let's say if we're in the context of fishing rights, that I want my fishing rights, but you go into the specifics of why you want it. Maybe you talk about your family, maybe you speak about how much you love to go in the sea and how it's a tradition that you've been following through generations. So this is not something related to the main narrative. And then you come back to the main topic, and then you make a new shift again. So this could be a way to implement this negotiation strategy in a fractal way. On the other side, if you're on the strong side, on the strong part of the discourse, so for example, you're a regulator and you're being requested something, I think that for them, having lower alpha would be more beneficial, because it means it would be more cyclical. And usually when something has a cycle or a period, it's pretty hard to get through to it. So if their intention is to resist, probably, they would be more cyclical in their argument. They would just constantly say why it's not possible or why it has to be restricted. But at the same time, if they were into negotiating and also adapting to the propositions that the other side makes, they're much better off being more fractal as well. So really, yes, I think negotiation is a great use case for that. And if you're interested to try it out together, please don't hesitate to contact me. I will leave my email in the chat, and you can write back. And if you have some data, you can send this to me, and we can see together what would be the best way to analyze it. And Joachim is saying, would be cool to analyze a William Gibson text. Also, would be very nice to analyze, for instance, the UN documentation related to the negotiation of Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing, more than 10 meetings with hundreds, even thousands of brackets to be solved with agreements. Yes, Joachim, this is a really great idea. If you want to work on it, please let me know. I will be very happy to collaborate in this direction, because it's a new feature that has just been added, and of course it's great to see how it could work. And also Joachim says, I would love to make a comparison of the physical position of brackets in text and the compromise solution via language. Yes, I mean, we could also somehow analyze text on this very detailed level of where punctuation marks appear, and you know, what is the fractal signature of the actual dynamics of the breaks that exist within the text. This is another very important point. I think there are studies on that, also on the length of the words used, and in those studies they also show that the natural tendency of text is to be fractal, just because of the way, maybe how it makes it easier for us to perceive meaning when it's something a little bit irregular. We can adjust, we can adapt, and so on. But yes, I mean, it would be also interesting to see in terms of how the influence unfolds over time. And also, we are planning to implement a word-to-vec algorithm. I'm going to write it in the chat for those of you who are into NLP tools. You can check this out. The words, they have cosine distance. So, for example, reading and writing are close to each other in terms of the semantic proximity. But for instance, mind and let's say even deliberate, but authority are further. And if we see how the narrative unfolds over time based on the distances, on the semantic distances between the words that are covered, we will be also able to observe a very interesting picture of how the narrative unfolds over time. But in this case, it would not be the influence fractality, but rather semantic proximity of the word. So this is something that we're going to add. If you're interested to read more about this subject, then click on the question mark. You have all the references here, which you can then Google or explore on our support portal. And for those of you who are familiar with the trended fluctuation analysis, you can even see the chart that shows how the fluctuations and the different scales fit onto the alpha polynomial. So this is something for you who are interested in these technical subjects. Another element that was added into the graph is the degree distribution. And here what happens is that it builds a graph that shows how the degrees are distributed. So the horizontal axis is the degree of the node, and the vertical one are the fraction of the nodes. And we can see here that, for instance, most of the nodes are around 20, 30, 10 degrees. There's only a few with a high number of connections. We can choose another text. For example, let's go back to Nabokov and look at the degree distribution chart here. Here we see that there is a power law identified. So basically it sort of builds based on this. Let me show you the linear. So it builds like a distribution histogram and then tries to fit what kind of distribution would be the closest fit to it. And if it's a power law one, which means that there is a few but significant number of nodes with the high number of connections with the high degree, and most of the nodes, they have low degree, and the decay happens in a quite steep way, then it's going to identify that there is a power law in the degree distribution. And usually in network science, it means that the network is scale-free, which has implications on its propagation qualities as well. So basically, if you have power law, it might be easier for the discourse to propagate, given that the network has a high connectivity. So this is another technical measure about the structure of the discourse, the structure of the network, which you could also apply to social networks, by the way. And if you want to read more about it, you can see here the help articles, which will explain in detail how it works. There's a little bug here. We're going to fix it, just the positioning of the helping button. Okay. Let's move on a little bit more to demonstrate some other features. So in the trends panel, we had the bigrams, which are now moved to the stats panel here. And the bigrams are the top relations between the words that tend to appear in the text. So these are the top phrases that are very typical. So here it's pine trunk, pine needle, tree, and so on. Let's take a speech that everyone might relate to. Maybe a Wikipedia article in network theory. Load this up. Look at the stats, and we have that network theory is the top relation, network analysis, conserve spread, network node, social network, and so on. Centrality measure. So we can quickly see what are the main phrases that appear in the text. And we can, of course, download them for further analysis and read more about what each of these parameters mean. Also, interesting, the network statistics panel, and specifically something that might be quite exciting is this idea of diversivity. And this is basically between a centrality divided by the degree. And what that means is that the nodes that have a high diversivity will have a high influence per the number of connections they have. And what you want is to see some irregularities. So you can click here to sort the nodes by diversivity, and then look at betweenness and see if there is any node with a high degree which is actually shown lower, or with a low degree which is shown higher. So for example, here we have a node with a low degree of 9 scale, but it has a high diversivity. Or we have problem, again, relatively high diversivity for the betweenness centrality that it has. So this can be an interesting way for us to see what words have a lot of influence, even though they don't have so much connections. And usually these will be the words that bring you to some parts of the graph that are relevant, but that are not so represented. So this is something that you can use this table for. Another statistical feature that was added into the text is something that has been long due. If you click on the information panel here, you have the word count for every text, the unique lemmas. Lemmas are the actual words that are identified as the nodes in the graph. So network theory are the nodes. Is not a node, it's in the stop list. The is also in the stop list, and it's the study, representation, relations becomes relations. This is a lemma, and so on. The number of characters, lemma's density. This is the proportion of unique lemmas to total lemmas. The higher this number, the more diverse vocabulary is used in this text. So for example, here it's a Wikipedia article. It's quite low. It means that the lemmas repeat themselves quite a lot. If you take Nabokov's text, the lexical diversity will be pretty high. By the way, what I'm doing now, I'm using the search function in the menu here. For those of you who have a lot of graphs, can be a nice life hack, but we will add a search feature soon there. So here you see lemma's density is much higher. That means that Nabokov is using a lot of really diverse and specific words, and he repeats himself much less than a normal Wikipedia article, for example. You also have project notes here. So if I want to leave a note here and say that this is Nabokov's The Gift excerpt from chapter 5, I can even leave a link here, click save, and then this note will always be with this graph. So each time I reload it, I can see what this graph is about. I can also leave some research notes or some observations that I have about this graph here. And in the text settings, I have here the number of nodes that are shown, which I can extend, but mind it will be slower to load the graph if it's more than 150. And also some merge nodes. Merge nodes is the ability of the graph to build phrases. So for example, let's say you want to specify pine needles as one word. So you select pine needle, then you click merge, then you add it as a new node, and now this node is going to be pine needle. And you can do so with the other text as well. Let's say dark shade should be one word, so then you can make it one word. If then you decide that you want to break this pattern, you can also just select the phrase and break it, and then the text will be reloaded, and this will be two phrases again. And you can also do the same here. You can unmerge all the connections that you made, and then after you reload the text, everything will be individual words again. Of course, if you're building a mind map, you can also add phrases. If you do something like this, you say pine needles and dark brown, and then it's going to make a connection between two nodes. One will be pine needle, one dark brown. If you want, you can also use square brackets for this. So just type in like this, like wiki links, pine needle are dark brown, you see, and then you can add connections between phrases like this. This is especially useful if you're building mind maps, which I demonstrated in another webinar earlier on. So this can be something that you can try later. I will look at more questions now. When looking at biggrams, is there a lemmatizer facility? Well, all the biggrams are already lemmatized, so they are already lemmas. And Ralph is saying, I use this tool to disambiguate drugs, genes, disease, and therapies in a clinical trial. Drugs, genes, diseases, and therapies have many different synonyms that are equivalent. I found that synonyms would cluster around each other. The data collected in many different ways, so there was no consistent reporting of results. So it would be interesting, Ralph, to know, did you manage actually to reach the objective of your research? Because if you say that the synonyms were clustered around each other, then I guess it made it possible for you to see, you know, which topics belong together. By the way, if you did this, you can also export this data. And Ralph says that he was able to disambiguate the terms. That's great. So, for instance, if you have these results here in the Essence panel, you have topical groups. You can also download them. And also a great new feature, which I forgot to mention, are the full stats that show you the full list of nodes in every topic. So this is very convenient if you want to, you know, download it and analyze it later. You just click here, and then it exports a file, exactly this file that shows you what are the nodes in each topic, what's the percentage of nodes in each of them, what's the percentage of entries. So for example, an interesting thing here is that the second one, power form political, is at the second place by the number of nodes that are in the topic, but a lot of entries, they belong to this topic, they were marked with this topic. So this can be a very interesting observation as well. And if you did something like you did with studying which terms cluster together, if you just want something a bit more useful, you can click on the full stats here and then download the graph, and you know, you will have it all in a spreadsheet format, which might be more usable for later representation of results. Of course, you can also export the graph itself. If you click here, then you download the PNG image or SVG if you want to print it in high resolution. This is also possible. Can one influence the colors in the map? Is asking Chengai. Yes, you have a setting like I showed at the beginning in the settings panel. Here, there are a few options. You have the default color, which is a bit brighter, darker color that we have now, subdued, which is a bit black and whitish kind of, monochrome and contrast, which are more or less the same thing, but contrast is black and white, which is slightly brighter. We might build in a feature that allows you to really custom design the color palettes that would be used, and even make it possible to assign certain colors to certain terms. But for that, we would need you to leave it as a feature request on our forum. And if a few people like it, then of course we will add this as a functionality. There's a lot of other requests, so we just need to focus on the stuff that people really want to use. Then in the questions for the webinar, there was one asking about search engine optimization, which might be interesting for those of you who are also doing research about different markets or different interests, different research topics, and so on. So these two applications here, SEO and market niche, are the same. I'm going to use market niche because SEO people will understand what that means also. Let's say I would like to optimize for a certain topic like health foods. So what happens here is that I type it in, I choose that, okay, I want it to be in English and in the USA market. And when I click enter, what happens is that first it imports search results for this topic, health foods. What will we see on Google's search results page if we search for health foods? And then it imports the search suggestions, which are usually based on what people search for when they search for health foods. So we see on the one side the graph of what people actually get when they search for health foods. You see they get a lot of results about organic, supplements, healthy, nutrition, and so on. You can click on each of them and see what is the search result that contains those terms on the left. And another graph is what people actually search for. So you know when you go on Google and you start searching for something, it suggests you a possible continuation of your search query. This is based on what other people like you also search for when they search in relation to the phrase that you're typing in. And here we're importing this data as well and show you what are the patterns of search that are related to health foods. As you can see, health foods are removed from the graph itself because obviously people also search for health foods, but you see that they also search for healthy meals, weight loss, and so on, fat burning. So this is what people are interested in. This is what they get. Now, the most interesting part is the difference between the demand and the supply. What are they interested in, but that they don't get? And here we have some really interesting stuff like meal plans is something they don't really get so much when they search for health foods. So if you were creating content about health foods, you would want to write about meal plans. Then lose weight, recipes to lose weight. This is also not so present. As you can see, people are focusing on health foods, supplements, and organic, kind of using the synonyms, but not really talking about the reason why people want to eat healthy. And in this case, it's to lose weight. So this can be quite interesting for you as a strategy. And also a very nice note here, which is talking about gut health. So again, much more specific than health foods, but people are searching for it. So if you make an article on health foods that mention recipes to lose weight, meal plans, and also something that's good for the gut flora, you're very likely to be in very high demand because that's what people search for, but they don't find. Of course, you can use this approach for much different subjects, lot of different subjects. Like, for example, if you're making a research about a certain topic, you can also type in network analysis here, and then see what's missing on network analysis in the current discourse. So this can be interesting for researchers, for marketers, and if you're just a curious person, I encourage you to use this feature, because when you're just about to venture into a certain project or a certain research, it can be really interesting to study it first from this perspective, and see what people actually need and what's missing, because then you're much more likely to hit a sweet spot. And by the way, this is why it's also a very powerful search engine optimization tool for Google, because our experience is that once you start writing your content in this way, it becomes much easier to push it to the front of the search results. So in the case before, if we wrote something about meal plans and diets, it would be at the top of the search results. Here, if we talk about network analysis, we see that people are looking for open source tools, something not so readily present. Download free, of course, as it's always the case with tools and software, and also PDFs. So if you were to write about network analysis, maybe if you make a PDF, or if you write about an open source tool or downloading them for free, or make a list of the tools that you can download for free, you would really cater to this audience here. If you're doing a research, then maybe researching and comparing different applications that are open source and putting it into a PDF and making it available to download would make your research much more available to people and much more visible in Google search results. If you have any more questions, please let me know in the Q&A session. Our webinar is coming to an end. Also, you can use the chat feature, and I will leave my email again in case you need to contact me with any questions about your use case, if you have any ideas based on what we talked about today, and so on. In the meanwhile, when I was looking through the questions that people asked when they were signing up for the webinar, someone asked how to identify the central idea of different interactions in which there isn't a single but different central ideas, each clusters. It's written like that. So basically, it's the same approach. You take a text, let's say this is a certain discourse, Obama's 2004 DMC address, and we want to get a main idea out of it. So the approach that I usually like to take is to look at the graph first and see what comes up. I see that, okay, America, believe John Kerry, hope. Okay, America, believe John Kerry. So I know that he wants America to believe that John Kerry is a good candidate, or he believes that and he wants to promote this idea. And then we see lots of auxiliary nodes like child, man, young, state, and so on, that can be quite interesting as well. Then what I like to do is to go into the analytics panel and verify my insights that I obtained visually in a more technical way. So I see that, okay, there's a big cluster about John Kerry, America, state, white. Okay, let's see what is about state white. So I can click on the nodes and see in which context these words were used. And here is his phrase: there is not a Black American, white American, Latino American, Asian America, there's the United States of America. So it's this unifying message that he's putting through in that part of the discourse. Then how America is important in the world arena, and then some thoughts about young people and families. And then if you click here, you see more topics and so on. So it's pretty clear what he's talking about. He's talking about families, young people, race, and he's talking about America being a great country. And then he kind of brings this discourse to the point where he proposes that John Kerry would be the candidate to resolve all this. This was his address in 2004 at the Democratic Congress. So this is why he was talking about this. And also, if you look at the trends panel here, you will also see that John Kerry appears towards the end. Okay, so a lot of examples at first, and then sort of a final push in the end to encourage people to vote for John Kerry. You also have the same idea here, as you can see in the propagation dynamics, not so many influential words, and then finally a big influential push for John Kerry here. So we can even see how the structure of this narrative was like a slow build-up of a wave, and then the final sort of impulse, crescendo, so to say, and then the speech is over. So this is how you would analyze the main topics and also the dynamics of how they evolved over time. Hope this answers your question. Loretta is asking, is this being used with bank regulatory text? I think some people are using it for that, but of course we don't know what the users are using it for due to privacy concerns that they might have. But if you're interested to run this use case with us, we would be very curious to see how it could be used. For this, we need to know, of course, what the objectives are of that study. I will look at more questions from the registration form for the webinar. If you have any in the meanwhile, please let me know in the chat. Someone was asking how to highlight the nodes to make them more visible. So as I showed here, you can just increase the label size. Also make the label size the same color as the same size as the nodes, and then same color. So this might be a nice way to highlight the most influential ones. And then if you remove less relevant ones and then you move around some of them, then you have a very nice, neat mind map or tech cloud, which is much better than tech cloud because it shows you which words are used in the same context in proximity. If you wanted it to be even prettier, then you can unify the nodes like this. John Kerry becomes one node. Young man, young child, we keep it like that. America, state. This we call United States of America. Okay, so here we have an overview of his discourse in a nutshell. And this is how you make the nodes more visible. Then you can export them using this button here in whatever format you prefer. Okay, if you don't have any more questions, I think I answered everything that we had so far in the registration form and also in the chat window. The next webinar will take place in about 2 or 3 weeks. If you have any questions or any requests, please let me know by email or via the support portal if you have any topics you would like to discuss. Try out all these features, the discourse dynamics one, the trends here, the narrative propagation, degree distribution, and so on. Also, this one here that shows you how the discourse evolved over time. That can be quite interesting. And let me know if you have any questions. I will be very happy to help you. Thank you very much for joining today, and I hope you will have a good day. It was a pleasure to do this presentation. And yes, let me know if you need to answer any questions. If you have any requests, the email or the support portal will be in touch. Thank you very much.